Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping quietly into the world of medieval assassination, where death was a business with more paperwork than you'd expect. Ever wonder how many people had to approve a single murder contract before anyone could actually die? So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy our nighttime stories. Now it's time to dim the lights and let the story carry you away. The morning bell rings at dawn in 1347, and you've just received your first assignment as a professional assassin in Florence. You might imagine yourself slipping through shadows with a concealed blade, but the reality is far more tedious than romantic. Your day begins not with poison or daggers, but with administrative procedures that would make a modern bureaucrat weep with recognition and despair. First, you must report to the guild offices. Yes, even assassins had guilds in medieval Italy. The Compagnia della Morte, the Company of Death, maintained meticulous records of every contract, every payment, and every method employed. The guild master, Ser Giovanni di Moretti, sits behind a desk covered in parchment scrolls, each one tied with different coloured ribbons to indicate the type of service requested. Red for political enemies, blue for romantic rivals, yellow for business disputes, green for family inheritance issues, purple for religious heretics, and the dreaded black ribbon for church-related eliminations, which required papal dispensation and took months to process through ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The office itself smells of parchment, sealing wax, and the peculiar mustiness that accumulates in rooms where people spend their days documenting death. Wooden shelves line the walls, filled with leather-bound ledgers dating back generations. Each ledger contains detailed records of completed contracts, including the client's name, target's description, method employed, fee structure, and post-completion documentation. The guild took considerable pride in their record keeping, often pointing out that they maintained better archives than most monasteries. Your target, Giovanni explains in his measured bureaucratic tone, is Messer Paolo Benedetti, a wool merchant who has been skimming from the guild treasury. He hands you a scroll sealed with the guild's official wax stamp, a skull surrounded by quill pens. The irony of literary symbols on an assassination order was apparently lost on medieval administrators, though the guild's chaplain had once delivered a lengthy sermon about the appropriateness of combining symbols of death and learning. The scroll contains not just the target's name, but his daily routine down to the quarter hour, preferred taverns with seating preferences, the names of his servants and their personal habits, his confessor's schedule and favourite theological topics, his wife's shopping patterns, his children's tutoring arrangements, and most importantly, the approved methods of elimination as determined by guild regulations, client preferences, and seasonal availability of materials. This is where your first problem begins. Medieval assassination wasn't a matter of creative freedom or spontaneous violence. Every killing had to follow strict guild regulations, established over decades of professional practice, legal precedent, and unfortunate incidents that had resulted in unwanted attention from civic authorities. The guild maintained detailed case files of past mistakes, which served as cautionary tales and training materials for new recruits. Poison was restricted to certain feast days when it could be disguised among rich foods, but only during specific seasons when the necessary ingredients were available. Summer contracts could employ nightshade, which grew wild in the countryside. Winter assignments were limited to imported substances like arsenic or mercury, which were expensive and required special handling permits from the city's physician guild. Spring offered the best selection of herbal toxins, but also the highest risk of detection, since everyone knew which plants were dangerous. Blade work required witnesses from the guild to verify proper technique and ensure the death appeared professionally executed, rather than the result of common street violence. These witnesses needed to be positioned strategically to observe the killing without appearing connected to the assassin. The guild maintained a network of seemingly unrelated individuals, merchants, beggars, street sweepers, tavern keepers, who could provide credible testimony about the circumstances of death. Accidents, pushing someone off a bridge, arranging for a cart to lose its wheel at precisely the right moment, causing structural collapses or animal attacks, needed extensive documentation proving the incident appeared genuinely accidental. The guild employed former engineers, architects, and even veterinarians who could advise on the technical aspects of creating believable mishaps. The paperwork alone could take hours and required literacy skills that many assassins lacked. Forms Avonbeer required you to list your intended method, backup method, and contingency method, with detailed explanations of why each approach was suitable for the specific target and circumstances. The form included sections for material requirements, timing considerations, potential witnesses, and risk assessment factors that might affect the operation's success. Form It detailed your escape route, including safe houses, accomplices, alternate identities, and contingency plans for various scenarios. The guild maintained safe houses throughout the city, but using them required advance reservation and payment of daily fees. Some safe houses were disguised as legitimate businesses: a baker's shop, a scribe's office, a cloth merchant's warehouse, and you needed to maintain your cover story even while hiding from authorities. Form XAC, perhaps most tediously, required you to estimate the time of death down to the quarter hour, because the guild needed to coordinate with the city's death registrar to ensure proper documentation of the deceased. Medieval cities maintained detailed records of deaths, births, and marriages, and suspicious gaps in documentation could trigger investigations. The guild had established relationships with various city officials who could ensure that death certificates were processed smoothly, but this required precise timing and advance notice. But that wasn't even the strangest part. Medieval assassins had to maintain their cover identities with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to their killings. You couldn't simply lurk in taverns looking mysterious or disappear for days without explanation. You needed a legitimate trade, complete with guild membership in that profession, tax records, established relationships with suppliers and customers, and a reputation for competent work in your chosen field. Most assassins worked as barbers, since the razor skills transferred nicely, and the profession provided legitimate reasons to handle sharp instruments and study human anatomy. The Barbers' Guild was surprisingly cooperative with these arrangements, partly because assassins paid their dues promptly and never complained about working conditions. Other popular cover professions included bakers, who had access to ovens for disposing of evidence, candle makers, who worked with wax and flames, and scribes who could forge documents when necessary. Your assigned cover story requires you to be Giacomo the Barber, and maintaining this identity means actually cutting hair and shaving beards for real customers. The Assassin's Guild provided detailed training in barbering techniques, not just for authenticity, but because a bad haircut would draw unwanted attention faster than a suspicious death. Medieval people took their grooming seriously, and barbers were expected to know the latest styles, understand the social significance of different beard shapes, and provide commentary on local gossip while they worked. The Guild's barbering manual ran to over 200 pages, covering everything from proper razor maintenance to techniques for extracting teeth, setting bones, and treating various ailments. Medieval barbers were essentially medical practitioners, and your cover identity required you to actually heal people while secretly planning to kill others. The irony was not lost on the Guild's more philosophically inclined members, who occasionally held lengthy debates about the moral implications of their dual roles. The morning procedures continue with inventory management that would challenge a modern laboratory. Professional assassins maintained equipment lists that were checked and updated daily. Your kit includes 17 different types of poison, each with specific applications, expiration dates, and storage requirements. Arsenic was quick and reliable, but left obvious symptoms that could trigger investigations. Hemlock produced a more natural-seeming death, but required precise dosing based on the victim's body weight, health condition, and recent meals. Nightshade could be disguised in wine, but you needed to account for the victim's drinking habits, tolerance for alcohol, and preference for sweet or dry vintages. The Guild maintained detailed files on the drinking preferences of prominent citizens, updated through a network of tavern keepers, wine merchants and servants who reported on their employers' habits. Other poisons included mercury, which could be mixed with cosmetics or medical treatments, lead compounds that could be added to pottery glazes or paint, and various plant extracts that produce symptoms resembling common diseases. Each poison required different preparation methods, storage conditions, and delivery techniques. Some needed to be kept cold, others required protection from light, and several were unstable compounds that could become ineffective or dangerously unpredictable if not handled properly. The Guild maintained a poison laboratory in the basement of their headquarters, staffed by former alchemists and physicians who had been recruited for their chemical knowledge. These specialists prepared standardized doses, tested new compounds, and provided technical support for complex poisoning operations. They also maintained detailed records of every poison's effects, including onset time, duration, symptoms, and detectability by various antidotes or medical examinations. Then there were the blades. Guild regulations specified different weapons for different social classes, because even in death, medieval society maintained its hierarchical distinctions. Nobility required ceremonial daggers with jeweled handles and inscribed blades. Even in death, appearances mattered, and a poorly crafted weapon would reflect badly on the Guild's professional standards. These ceremonial weapons were expensive, often costing more than a craftsman's annual income, and were usually recovered after the killing for reuse in future contracts. Merchants could be dispatched with good quality but plain knives, the kind that might be carried by any respectable tradesman for practical purposes. The Guild maintained contracts with several weaponsmiths who produced these standard assassination tools, marked with subtle symbols that identified them as Guild equipment while appearing to be ordinary commercial products. Peasants and labourers were assigned whatever was cheap and available, usually repurposed farm implements like sickles, pruning knives, or sharpened tools. The Guild's weapon master, a former soldier named Tommaso, maintained detailed records of which weapons were appropriate for different social situations and could advise on the best choices for specific targets. Each weapon had to be blessed by a Guild chaplain before use. Yes, medieval assassins had their own priest, Father Donato, a former Franciscan monk who had been expelled from his order for reasons that remained diplomatically vague. He performed special masses for the souls of both killers and victims, maintained detailed records of confessions, assigned penances, and sold indulgences to offset the spiritual cost of professional murder. The church, it turned out, was surprisingly accommodating when proper fees were paid and appropriate paperwork filed. Father Donato had developed a complex theological framework that justified assassination as a form of divine justice, arguing that professional killers were instruments of God's will, removing evil people from the world, according to a divine plan that mortals couldn't fully understand. His sermons on this topic were popular among Guild members, though they were carefully scheduled to avoid overlap with visits from church authorities. The blessing ceremony for weapons involved elaborate rituals that combined Christian prayers with older traditions that Father Donato claimed were based on ancient Hebrew practices. Each weapon was anointed with holy oil, inscribed with protective symbols, and blessed with prayers asking for divine guidance in striking true and ensuring the victim's soul would find appropriate judgment in the afterlife. Your actual mission begins at midday, after the morning's administrative duties are complete. Paolo Benedetti follows a predictable routine, visiting his wool warehouse every day at the same time. But medieval cities weren't designed for discreet surveillance. Streets were narrow, crowded, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Strangers were noticed immediately, particularly strangers who seemed to be watching specific people or loitering without obvious purpose. The city's layout worked against professional surveillance. Florence's streets had evolved organically over centuries, creating a maze of narrow alleys, dead ends, and unexpected turns that made it easy to lose sight of a target, but also easy to become trapped if discovered. Buildings were tall and close together, creating deep shadows during the day, but also providing numerous hiding spots for potential ambushes. Guild wardens, city guards, and neighborhood gossips all kept watch for suspicious activity. The wardens were representatives of various trade guilds who monitored their districts for unauthorized commercial activity or suspicious behavior. City guards patrolled on regular schedules, but they also responded to reports from citizens who noticed unusual activity. Most challenging were the neighborhood gossips, usually older women, who spent their days watching street activity from windows and doorways, ready to report anything unusual to anyone who would listen. The guild's solution was elaborate but effective, staged social interactions. You couldn't simply watch Paolo, you had to become part of his social environment. This meant befriending his regular customers, learning about his family relationships, understanding his business disputes, and gradually inserting yourself into his daily routine. Professional assassination in medieval times was less about stealth and more about social engineering. The process began weeks before any actual killing attempt. Guild members would pose as potential customers, visiting Paolo's warehouse to examine wool samples, discuss prices, and establish themselves as legitimate business contacts. Other guild members would frequent the same taverns, gradually becoming familiar faces in Paolo's social circle. Still others would develop relationships with his servants, suppliers, and family members, creating a network of information sources and potential access points. This social infiltration required considerable acting ability and social skills. Guild members needed to understand wool trading, fashion trends, seasonal price fluctuations, and the complex relationships between different merchant families. They studied the technical aspects of wool production, from sheep breeding to fabric weaving, so they could engage in convincing conversations about quality, pricing, and market conditions. The guild maintained detailed files on prominent citizens, including their business interests, family relationships, personal habits, fears, ambitions, and weaknesses. These files were constantly updated through reports from various sources, creating comprehensive profiles that would impress modern intelligence agencies. Paolo's file, for example, contained information about his childhood, his arranged marriage, his relationship with his children, his business partnerships, his debts, his religious practices, and even his preferences in food, wine, and entertainment. But here's where the job becomes truly absurd. Medieval merchants were paranoid about poisoning, so they employed food tasters, used silver utensils that would supposedly tarnish if contaminated, and often ate only foods prepared by their own household staff. Paolo, being a successful wool merchant with enemies in the competitive textile trade, maintained all these precautions plus several of his own devising. He carried a unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, that supposedly detected poison when dipped in food or drink. This belief was so widespread that narwhal tusks were among the most valuable commodities in medieval Europe, often worth more than their weight in gold. Paolo's horn was mounted in a silver handle and carried in a special leather case, and he used it to test everything he consumed outside his own home. He wore rings with bezels containing bezoar stones, calcified masses taken from the stomachs of certain animals, which were believed to neutralize toxins through direct contact with the skin. Different types of bezoar stones were thought to be effective against different poisons, so wealthy merchants often wore multiple rings to ensure comprehensive protection. His wine was stored in vessels made from rhinoceros horn, another supposed antidote material. The guild's poison specialists had tested these various protective measures and found that while they were generally ineffective against properly prepared toxins, they did provide some protection against crude poison attempts. This meant that any poisoning of Paolo would need to use sophisticated compounds that could bypass his protective measures. Your guild training covered circumventing these precautions, but the methods were time-consuming and expensive. Bribing servants required weeks of cultivation and significant financial investment. Servants were typically loyal to their employers, partly from genuine affection, but mostly from practical considerations. Losing a position meant losing housing, food, and social connections that could be difficult to replace. The guild's approach to servant recruitment was methodical and psychological. They would identify servants with financial problems, family obligations, or personal ambitions that made them potentially receptive to bribery. Then they would approach these servants gradually, sometimes over months, building relationships and trust before ever mentioning the possibility of cooperation. Some servants were recruited through romantic relationships. The guild employed attractive men and women who specialized in seducing household staff, gradually winning their affection and loyalty before revealing their true purpose. These romantic recruitments were often the most reliable, since they involved genuine emotional bonds rather than simple financial transactions. Other servants were recruited through family pressure. The guild would identify servants whose relatives owed money, faced legal problems, or needed employment, then offer to solve these problems in exchange for cooperation. This approach was particularly effective because it didn't require the servant to directly betray their employer. They could convince themselves they were helping their family rather than participating in murder. Acquiring poisons that wouldn't react to silver or other detection methods meant dealing with alchemists who charged premium prices and asked uncomfortable questions. These alchemists were often scholars who had studied at universities but had been expelled for unorthodox experiments or ethical violations. They possessed genuine chemical knowledge but operated on the margins of respectable society. The guild maintained relationships with several alchemists in different cities, partly for access to their expertise, but partly to ensure their silence. These relationships were carefully managed through a combination of payments, threats, and mutual dependence. The alchemists needed the guild's protection from church authorities who viewed their work as potentially heretical, while the guild needed their chemical knowledge for sophisticated operations. Working around protective amulets and detection methods required understanding medieval beliefs about magic and medicine, beliefs that were often contradictory and changed depending on which scholar you consulted. The guild maintained an extensive library of medical and alchemical texts, including works by Arabic scholars that had been translated into Latin, ancient Greek medical treatises, and contemporary works by university-trained physicians. The afternoon brings another complication: record-keeping requirements during active operations. Guild regulations required hourly status reports, delivered to designated drop points throughout the city. These weren't simple, still following target notes, but detailed observations about the subject's activities, mood, companions, and any changes to established patterns. The reports needed to include information about who the target talked to, what they discussed, any changes in their routine, signs of increased security precautions, and observations about their emotional state that might affect their behavior. If Paolo seemed nervous or suspicious, it might indicate that he had learned about the contract against him, which would require immediate changes to the operation plan. The Guild maintained these records for legal protection. If a contract was disputed, or if authorities investigated, detailed documentation could prove the assassination was conducted according to professional standards and contractual obligations. These records also served as training materials for future operations, helping the Guild develop better techniques and avoid past mistakes. The drop points were located in various businesses throughout the city: a baker's shop, a manuscript dealer's stall, a tavern's private room, a church's confession booth. Each drop point was staffed by Guild members or sympathizers who could receive reports, forward them to headquarters, and provide emergency assistance if needed. The system was designed to be redundant, so that if one drop point was compromised, operations could continue through alternate channels. Writing these reports presented its own challenges. Most assassins were barely literate, hired for physical skills rather than scholarly ability. Many had learned to read and write just well enough to handle basic Guild paperwork, but composing detailed surveillance reports in proper medieval Latin legal terminology was beyond their capabilities. The Guild provided template phrases and standard abbreviations, but documenting complex surveillance observations still required constant reference to instruction manuals. Many assassins carried small books of standard phrases disguised as prayer books or merchant account ledgers. These books contained pre-written descriptions of common situations, emotional states, and behavioral patterns that could be copied into reports with minimal modification. The Guild also employed professional scribes, who could help illiterate members prepare their paperwork. These scribes were sworn to secrecy and were often former monks or university students who had been recruited through various means. They worked in small offices near Guild headquarters, helping members translate their spoken observations into properly formatted written reports. As evening approaches, you discover that Paolo has altered his routine. Instead of dining at his usual tavern, he's accepted an invitation to feast with Ser Antonio Grimaldi, a local noble with connections to the ruling Medici family. This creates a cascade of bureaucratic problems that would challenge modern project managers and requires immediate consultation with Guild supervisors. First, you need Guild approval to operate on noble property. Form XXL requires detailed architectural plans of the target location, complete guest lists, servant schedules, security arrangements, and assessments of potential political complications. The Guild maintains extensive files on noble households, but accessing this information means returning to Guild offices, explaining the situation to the duty clerk, and waiting for approval from senior members who might not be available until the following day. The architectural plans were particularly detailed, showing not just room layouts, but also structural vulnerabilities, escape routes, hiding places, and potential hazards. The Guild employed former soldiers and engineers who specialized in architectural reconnaissance, creating detailed drawings and models of important buildings throughout the city. These plans included information about guard patrol routes, servant movement patterns, and the daily schedules of household residents. Noble guest lists were carefully maintained because they indicated potential witnesses, political complications, and additional security measures. If Paolo was dining with politically connected guests, his death could trigger investigations that might expose the Guild's operations. The Guild needed to assess whether the contract was worth the risk of increased attention from powerful families. Security arrangements in noble households were typically more sophisticated than those employed by merchants. Nobles employed professional guards, maintained armories, and often had agreements with city authorities for additional protection when needed. Some nobles also employed their own intelligence networks, including spies and informants who could detect suspicious activity around their properties. Second, operating near nobility required different insurance coverage. Standard guild membership covered accidental deaths of bystanders up to 3 persons of merchant class or below. Noble casualties triggered much higher liability rates and required additional paperwork with the city's legal authorities. The guild maintained relationships with corrupt officials who could help manage these complications, but their services were expensive and not always reliable. The insurance system was surprisingly sophisticated for medieval times. The guild maintained funds to compensate families of innocent victims, pay bribes to officials who might investigate suspicious deaths, and provide legal representation for guild members who were arrested. They also maintained emergency funds for relocating members whose identities were compromised and for establishing new operations in other cities if their activities in Florence became too dangerous. Third, the logistics of poison delivery become exponentially more complex in noble households. Kitchen staff were supervised by stewards who knew every servant personally and monitored food preparation closely. These stewards were often former soldiers or administrative officials who understood security procedures and could recognize potential threats. Food preparation in noble households followed elaborate protocols designed to prevent contamination, both accidental and intentional. Multiple tasters sampled every dish, and meals were often prepared in duplicate as a precaution against poisoning attempts. The kitchen staff worked in teams, with each person responsible for specific tasks and monitored by others, making it difficult for any individual to tamper with food without detection. Getting poison into a specific person's food in a room full of witnesses without affecting other diners was nearly impossible using conventional methods. The guild had developed specialized techniques for these situations, including delayed action poisons that wouldn't take effect until hours after consumption, and targeted delivery methods that could affect only the intended victim even when multiple people consumed the same food. The guild's recommended solution was to abandon the poisoning approach and switch to Method 7, staged accident during evening travel. This meant following Paolo home from the feast and arranging for him to suffer an unfortunate encounter with runaway horses, falling masonry, or a collapsing bridge. Medieval cities provided plenty of opportunities for accidental death. Construction standards were minimal, and urban planning consisted mostly of hoping problems would solve themselves. But staged accidents required their own specialized paperwork and preparation. Form 14C documented pre-incident site preparation, loosening stones, weakening rope, bribing cart drivers, or arranging for animals to spook at precisely the right moment. The guild maintained relationships with stonemasons, rope makers, stable masters, and even city engineers who could provide technical advice on structural vulnerabilities. The guild's accident specialists were former soldiers, engineers, and craftsmen who understood the technical aspects of creating believable mishaps. They could calculate how much damage was needed to cause a building collapse, determine the best locations for staging animal attacks, and arrange for mechanical failures that would appear to be the result of poor maintenance rather than deliberate sabotage. Creating a convincing accident required extensive preparation and perfect timing. If a bridge collapsed too early or too late, Paolo might avoid the trap entirely. If falling stones missed their target, the incident would be investigated as a potential attack rather than an accident. If horses stampeded at the wrong moment, innocent bystanders might be killed, triggering the expensive insurance complications that the guild wanted to avoid. Your evening reconnaissance reveals another layer of complexity. Paolo travels with guards, not professional soldiers, but armed servants whose job is to deter casual robbers and provide assistance in case of accidents or emergencies. These men know the streets, carry weapons, and would investigate anything suspicious. Medieval cities after dark were dangerous places, and anyone with money hired protection for evening travel. The guards were typically former soldiers or men from rural areas who had come to the city seeking employment. They were loyal to their employers and took their responsibilities seriously, partly from professional pride, but mostly because failure could result in dismissal and unemployment. They knew the common tactics used by robbers and were trained to recognize potential threats. Dealing with guards meant either bribing them, creating distractions, or accepting that they might become additional casualties. Each option required different paperwork and different guild approvals. Bribery needed financial authorization and background checks on the guards' reliability and discretion. The guild needed to ensure the bribed guards would remain silent after the operation and wouldn't attempt to blackmail the guild or reveal information to authorities. Creating distractions required coordination with other guild members and careful timing. The guild might arrange for a tavern fight, a fire, a runaway cart, or some other incident that would draw the guards' attention away from their employer. These distractions needed to appear genuinely accidental and couldn't be traced back to the guild's operations. Additional casualties triggered the expensive insurance coverage and potential legal complications with the guards' families. If guards were killed during an assassination, their families might demand compensation or justice, creating additional problems for the guild. The guild preferred to avoid killing guards when possible, but sometimes it was necessary for operational success. The night's work becomes a careful choreography of bureaucratic precision and split-second timing. You've arranged to loosen stones above a narrow alley where Paolo usually passes on his way home. The stones are carefully positioned so they will fall at the right moment, but appear to be the result of natural structural deterioration. The guild's stonework specialist has calculated the exact amount of mortar to remove so the stones will fall with lethal force, but won't bring down the entire wall. You've arranged for a tavern fight to distract Paolo's guards at the crucial moment. The fight involves guild members who specialize in creating convincing disturbances, and it's been choreographed to appear spontaneous while actually following a detailed script. The timing needs to be perfect, too early, and the guards will have resolved the situation before Paolo arrives, too late, and they might notice the falling stones in time to save their employer. You've bribed a stable boy to release horses at the crucial moment, creating additional chaos that will mask the sound of falling stones and provide an alternative explanation for Paolo's death. The horses are trained to run in a specific direction, and the stable boy has been coached on exactly when to open their stalls. The guild has even arranged for specific horses to be selected, animals that are known to be easily spooked, but not dangerous to innocent bystanders. Every element has been documented, approved, and assigned to specific guild members with backup plans and contingency procedures. The operation involves 12 different people, each with specific responsibilities and emergency procedures. If any element fails, there are backup plans to ensure the operation can continue or be safely aborted without exposing the guild's involvement. Then Paolo decides to spend the night at Ser Antonio's palazzo rather than travel home in the dark. This kind of last-minute change was exactly why experienced assassins develop drinking problems and nervous conditions. Months of preparation, dozens of forms, expensive bribes, and careful coordination, all wasted because the target made a sensible decision about nighttime safety. Medieval assassination work had a failure rate that would bankrupt modern businesses and drove many practitioners to seek less stressful employment. Guild regulations provided for contract extensions, but these required additional fees from the client, new paperwork, and updated risk assessments. The guild needed to evaluate whether the target's changed behavior indicated awareness of the contract, whether the new circumstances provided better or worse opportunities for completing the assignment, and whether the additional time and expense were justified by the potential success of the operation. Many contracts were simply abandoned at this point, with partial refunds issued to clients, and the target's name added to a list of difficult eliminations that junior assassins were warned to avoid. The guild maintained detailed records of failed contracts, analysing the reasons for failure, and using this information to improve their procedures and training programs. Your first day as a medieval assassin ends with you sitting in a cold alley, surrounded by loose stones and confused horses, filling out incident reports by candlelight. Form D3B requires detailed explanation of operational failures, lessons learned, and recommendations for future attempts. The form includes sections for technical analysis, personnel performance evaluation, and suggestions for procedural improvements. The Guild used these failure reports to improve training programs and update procedural manuals. They were also used to evaluate the performance of individual guild members and identify areas where additional training might be needed. The guild took a surprisingly professional approach to analysing failures, treating them as learning opportunities rather than personal shortcomings. The final insult comes when you return to guild headquarters near midnight. The duty clerk, a perpetually tired man named Bernardo, who has been processing assassination paperwork for over 20 years, informs you that Paolo Benedetti has been found dead in his chambers, apparently poisoned by a rival merchant who simply bribed a kitchen servant with no paperwork, no guild membership, and no professional training whatsoever. The unauthorized killing represents everything the guild opposed: sloppy technique, inadequate planning, unnecessary risk, and complete disregard for professional standards. The rival merchant had simply offered Paolo's cook a large sum of money to add poison to his evening meal, without any of the careful preparation, risk assessment, or procedural safeguards that the guild required. Medieval assassination, it turns out, was like most medieval professions, dominated by bureaucracy, hampered by regulations, and occasionally undermined by amateurs who ignored proper procedure and got lucky. The guild would spend weeks investigating the unauthorized killing, filing complaints with city authorities, and updating regulations to prevent future breaches of professional standards. The guild's response to amateur competition was typically bureaucratic. They would file formal complaints with various authorities, claiming that unauthorized killings violated trade regulations and public safety standards. They argued that professional assassins provided better service, created fewer complications, and operated according to established ethical guidelines that amateur killers ignored. Your first day as a medieval assassin ends with the sobering realization that death was indeed a business. But like most medieval businesses, it was strangled by paperwork, complicated by politics, and made nearly impossible by people who insisted on following the rules. The romance of shadows and daggers was reserved for ballads and stories. Real assassination work was mostly waiting, writing, and wondering why you hadn't chosen a simpler profession like banking or law. The guild's training manual, you discover, contains over 400 pages of procedures, regulations, case studies, and forms. Most successful assassins spent more time reading than killing, more time in meetings than in shadows, and more time explaining failures than celebrating successes. The medieval world, it seemed, had bureaucratized even murder into a routine administrative task, complete with quality control standards and customer satisfaction surveys. The quality control standards were particularly elaborate. The Guild maintained detailed criteria for evaluating the success of assassination contracts, including timeliness, discretion, minimal collateral damage, and customer satisfaction. They conducted post-operation interviews with clients to assess their satisfaction with the service and identify areas for improvement. Customer satisfaction surveys were distributed to clients several weeks after contract completion, asking about their experience with Guild services, the professionalism of assigned personnel, and their likelihood of recommending the Guild to others who might need similar services. The Guild used this feedback to improve their procedures and identify training needs for their members. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and do it all again. Because professional assassination was, above all, a job that required showing up on time, following procedures, and maintaining detailed records of everything that went wrong. The Guild provided steady employment, comprehensive training, and a pension plan for members who survived long enough to retire. It was, in its own peculiar way, one of the more stable careers available in medieval Florence. The pension plan was particularly attractive, since most medieval occupations provided no security for old age. Guild members who completed 20 years of service could retire with a modest income, a small house in the countryside, and the satisfaction of knowing they had contributed to the orderly conduct of professional murder in an increasingly chaotic world. What it was like to be a candle maker in Tudor England. The year is 1547, and you've just inherited your father's candle-making workshop in the bustling town of Coventry. What you didn't inherit was his collection of carefully guarded trade secrets, his established relationships with tallow suppliers, or his hard-won reputation for producing candles that didn't drip excessive wax onto customers' finest furniture. What you did inherit was a workshop full of mysterious equipment, a ledger written in your father's nearly illegible handwriting, and the immediate expectation that you would continue producing the same quality of illumination that had kept local households properly lit for the past 30 years. Medieval candle making was not, as you might imagine, a simple matter of dipping string into melted wax. It was a complex industrial process that required mastering chemistry, logistics, quality control, and customer relations in equal measure. Your father had spent decades perfecting techniques that he'd never bothered to explain, assuming he would have years to teach you gradually. His sudden death from winter fever had left you with a thriving business and absolutely no idea how to operate it. Your first challenge was deciphering the workshop itself. The main room contained 6 large iron cauldrons of different sizes, each designed for a specific stage of the candle-making process. The smallest was used for melting pure beeswax, which produced the highest quality candles, but was expensive enough that only wealthy households could afford them regularly. The largest cauldron was reserved for rendering tallow animal fat that had to be carefully processed to remove impurities that would cause smoking, sputtering, or unpleasant odors. But the really bizarre part came when you discovered that successful candle making required maintaining detailed relationships with every butcher, cook, and kitchen servant within a 20-mile radius. Tallow was the foundation of your business, but obtaining high-quality tallow required navigating a complex network of suppliers who all had their own schedules, standards, and opinions about fair pricing. Beef tallow produced the cleanest burning candles, but it was also the most expensive and hardest to obtain in large quantities. Mutton tallow was more readily available, but required extensive processing to achieve acceptable quality. Pork tallow was cheap and plentiful, but produced candles that smoked heavily and gave off an unpleasant smell that customers found objectionable. Your father's ledger contained cryptic notes about dozens of suppliers, Baker's Row good beef. Ask for Margaret, Tuesday deliveries. St. Michael's Kitchen, excellent mutton. Avoid the tall cook, payment monthly. Smithfield Market, mixed quality. Inspect everything, bring scales. These weren't just business relationships. They were carefully cultivated social connections that determined the success or failure of your entire operation. Medieval suppliers remembered customers who paid promptly, treated them fairly, and didn't complain unreasonably about quality variations. They also remembered customers who argued about prices, demanded special accommodations, or failed to honor their commitments. Your first week as a candle maker was spent visiting these suppliers and attempting to maintain the relationships your father had established. This proved more challenging than expected because medieval business relationships were deeply personal. Suppliers wanted to know that you shared your father's values, understood his methods, and would continue his practices. They weren't simply selling you raw materials, they were entrusting you with their reputation for providing quality ingredients. Margaret at Baker's Row, for instance, had been saving the finest beef tallow for your father's workshop for nearly 15 years. She knew exactly how he preferred it rendered, which cuts produced the cleanest fat, and how much processing time he needed to maintain his production schedule. She expected you to demonstrate the same level of knowledge and commitment. When you admitted that you weren't entirely sure how to evaluate tallow quality, Margaret's expression shifted from cautious optimism to barely concealed concern. Medieval craftspeople took their expertise seriously, and the idea that someone might attempt to operate a workshop without proper training was both professionally insulting and potentially dangerous to community standards. Fortunately, Margaret was also practical enough to recognize that teaching you was preferable to losing a reliable customer. She spent the better part of an afternoon explaining the subtle differences between various grades of tallow, how the color indicated freshness, why texture revealed processing quality, and what smells suggested contamination or improper storage. High-quality beef tallow should be pale yellow or nearly white, with a firm consistency that didn't feel greasy or sticky to the touch. It should smell clean and slightly sweet, without any traces of decay or strong animal odors. Tallow that was too soft indicated it had been overheated during rendering, which would cause finished candles to bend or melt in warm weather. Tallow that was too hard suggested contamination with other fats or improper processing that would create smoking and sputtering. But evaluating tallow was only the beginning of your education. You also had to learn how to render it properly, which was a multi-day process that required constant attention and precise timing. The rendering process began by cutting the tallow into small, uniform pieces, a task that was more difficult and important than it seemed. Pieces that were too large wouldn't melt evenly, creating hot spots that could burn and contaminate entire batches. Pieces that were too small would melt too quickly, making temperature control nearly impossible. Your father had apparently spent years perfecting the ideal size, which was roughly equivalent to a walnut half. The cut tallow was then placed in the largest cauldron with a small amount of water and heated very slowly over a carefully controlled fire. This was where candle making became more art than craft, because the temperature had to be maintained within a narrow range for several hours, while the fat gradually separated from any remaining tissue, blood, or other impurities. Too much heat would cause the tallow to foam and spatter, filling the workshop with acrid smoke and potentially ruining the entire batch. Too little heat would prevent proper separation, leaving impurities that would cause finished candles to burn poorly. The ideal temperature was hot enough that the tallow bubbled very gently, not a rolling boil, but a consistent, quiet simmering that slowly transformed raw fat into clean, workable material. Medieval candle makers judged temperature by sound, smell, and the appearance of the bubbling tallow. Your father's notes mentioned listening for the whisper of proper heat, a barely audible hissing that indicated optimal conditions. The smell should be clean and neutral, without the sharp odor that indicated overheating or the musty smell that suggested contamination. This process had to be maintained for 4 to 6 hours, during which you couldn't leave the workshop or allow your attention to wander. Medieval fires were unpredictable, and tallow was expensive enough that losing a batch to poor temperature control could represent weeks of lost income. While the tallow rendered, you had to prepare the wicks, a process that was equally complex and critical to the final product's quality. Tudor candles used wicks made from cotton or linen threads that had been carefully twisted to specific thicknesses and treated with particular solutions to ensure even burning. Wick preparation began with selecting the right type of thread. Cotton produced cleaner flames but was more expensive and sometimes difficult to obtain. Linen was more readily available and less costly, but it required more processing to achieve acceptable burning characteristics. Both materials had to be free from dyes, treatments, or contamination that might affect flame color or smoking. The individual threads were then twisted together using a small wooden device that controlled tension and uniformity. Wicks that were too loose would burn too quickly and drip excessively. Wicks that were too tight would burn too slowly and might extinguish themselves. The ideal thickness varied depending on the size of candle being produced, but it had to be consistent throughout the entire length to ensure even burning. Once twisted, the wicks were soaked in a solution of salt water and vinegar for several hours, then dried completely before use. This treatment helped prevent excessive smoking and reduced the tendency for wicks to bend or curl as they burned. Your father's notes included a recipe for this solution, but the measurements were recorded in his own personal units: 2 pinches of salt, enough vinegar to make it sharp, water to fill the small bowl. Converting these vague instructions into reliable procedures required considerable experimentation and several batches of poorly performing candles. But the really incredible part was discovering that Tudor customers had extremely specific expectations about candle performance that varied by social class, room usage, and seasonal preferences. Wealthy households expected candles that burned cleanly without dripping, produced steady flames that didn't flicker in drafts, and lasted for predictable periods of time. They were willing to pay premium prices for beeswax candles that met these standards, but they also demanded consistency. Each candle had to perform exactly like the previous ones they'd purchased. Middle-class households wanted reliable illumination at reasonable prices, which meant well-made tallow candles that didn't smoke excessively or produce unpleasant odors. They were more tolerant of minor quality variations, but they expected good value for their money and would switch suppliers if they felt they weren't being treated fairly. Working-class customers needed the cheapest possible illumination that would still provide adequate light for essential tasks. They were willing to accept smoking, dripping, and inconsistent burning as long as the price was affordable and the candles actually stayed lit. Each market segment required different production techniques, materials, and quality standards. Beeswax candles for wealthy customers had to be perfectly smooth, uniformly colored, and precisely sized. Tallow candles for middle-class households needed to be clean burning and reasonably attractive. Basic tallow candles for working families simply had to function reliably despite their obvious imperfections. Managing these different product lines required maintaining separate production processes, inventory systems, and quality control standards. Your workshop had to be organized to prevent cross-contamination between premium and basic materials, while still operating efficiently enough to remain profitable. The actual candle-making process varied depending on the intended market, but it always began with preparing the properly rendered tallow or melted beeswax. For tallow candles, the rendered fat was strained through fine cloth to remove any remaining particles, then reheated to the precise temperature needed for dipping or moulding. Dipping was the traditional method for producing individual candles. Prepared wicks were suspended from wooden frames and repeatedly dipped into the molten tallow, with each layer allowed to cool and harden before the next application. The process required dozens of dips to build up candles of adequate thickness, and each dip had to be timed precisely to ensure even coating and proper adhesion between layers. The temperature of the tallow was critical throughout the dipping process. If it was too hot, each new layer would melt the previous ones, preventing proper build-up. If it was too cool, the layers wouldn't adhere properly and would crack or peel during use. Medieval candle makers maintained optimal temperature by carefully managing their fires and occasionally testing the tallow with quick test dips using scrap wicks. Moulding was a more efficient method for producing multiple candles simultaneously, but it required expensive equipment and more sophisticated techniques. Wooden or metal moulds were filled with molten tallow or beeswax around pre-positioned wicks, then allowed to cool completely before removal. This method produced more uniform candles with smoother surfaces, but it also required precise timing and temperature control to prevent air bubbles, uneven filling, or poor wick positioning. Your father's workshop contained both dipping frames and moulding equipment, suggesting he'd served multiple market segments with different production methods. His notes indicated that beeswax candles were always moulded to achieve the smooth finish expected by wealthy customers, while tallow candles were usually dipped because the process was more forgiving of minor quality variations. But managing production was only part of your responsibilities as a Tudor candle maker. You also had to handle inventory, customer relations, seasonal variations in demand, and the complex regulations that governed craft production in medieval England. The worshipful company of tallow chandlers maintained strict standards for candle quality, weight, and pricing within their jurisdiction. Guild inspectors made regular visits to workshops, examining finished products and checking production records to ensure compliance with established regulations. Candles that failed to meet minimum standards were confiscated and destroyed, while repeat violations could result in fines, suspension of trading privileges, or expulsion from the guild. These regulations weren't simply bureaucratic harassment. They protected both consumers and legitimate craft workers from unfair competition and substandard products. Medieval markets had limited mechanisms for quality control, so guild standards served as essential consumer protection, while also maintaining the reputation of established trades. Your father's records showed regular interactions with guild inspectors, including detailed notes about their preferences, concerns, and evaluation methods. Inspector Thomas Whitmore apparently had strong opinions about proper wick sizing and would reject entire batches if he detected any variation in thickness. Inspector Margaret Caldwell focused primarily on weight accuracy and carried her own scales to verify that finished candles met the standard measurements for their designated sizes. Understanding these individual preferences was essential for maintaining good relationships with the guild and avoiding unnecessary complications during inspections. Medieval bureaucrats were human beings with personal opinions and professional pride, and treating them with appropriate respect could make the difference between minor corrections and major penalties. Seasonal demand patterns created additional challenges for planning and inventory management. Candle consumption increased dramatically during autumn and winter months, when daylight hours were shorter and indoor activities required artificial illumination. Spring and summer demand was much lower, but it was also more predictable because customers primarily needed candles for emergencies and special occasions. This seasonal variation meant that production had to be carefully timed to build inventory during slow periods, while maintaining capacity for increased demand during busy seasons. Your workshop had to stock sufficient raw materials for peak production periods, while avoiding waste from materials that might spoil during extended storage. Tallow could be stored for several months if kept cool and dry, but it gradually developed rancid odors that would affect candle quality. Beeswax was more stable, but also more expensive to keep in inventory for extended periods. Wicks could be prepared well in advance, but they had to be protected from moisture and contamination that would affect their burning characteristics. Customer relationships required ongoing attention throughout the year, not just during busy selling seasons. Regular customers expected consistent availability, reliable quality, and fair treatment during both peak and slow periods. They also expected candle makers to remember their preferences, accommodate special requests, and provide reasonable credit terms when circumstances required them. Your father's customer records revealed the complexity of these relationships. The household of Sir Edmund Hartwell required monthly deliveries of precisely 40 beeswax candles, each exactly 8 inches long and 1 inch in diameter, delivered on the first Tuesday of every month, regardless of weather or other complications. Lady Margaret Ashford preferred slightly thicker candles with cotton wicks, but only during winter months. Her summer orders specified linen wicks because she believed they produced less heat in warm weather. The Swan Inn needed large quantities of basic tallow candles for their common room, but their requirements varied dramatically based on seasonal occupancy and special events. During market days and harvest festivals, they might order 3 times their normal quantity, with only a few days' notice. During slow periods, they might cancel regular orders entirely and rely on existing inventory. Managing these varying demands required maintaining detailed records, flexible production schedules, and enough working capital to handle fluctuations in both supply costs and customer payments. Medieval businesses operated on much slower payment cycles than modern commerce, and customers often settled their accounts quarterly or seasonally rather than with each individual purchase. Your father's ledger showed that some established customers hadn't made payments for months, not because they were unreliable, but because their own income cycles didn't align with regular monthly settlements. Rural customers typically paid after harvest seasons. Urban customers often settled accounts quarterly, and institutional customers like churches or guilds might only handle payments once or twice per year. This meant that candle makers had to maintain sufficient working capital to purchase materials and pay expenses for extended periods while waiting for customer payments. They also had to develop sophisticated understanding of each customer's financial situation and payment patterns to avoid extending credit to households or businesses that might not be able to honor their obligations. But the most time-consuming aspect of Tudor candle making wasn't the actual production. It was the constant maintenance and cleaning required to keep equipment functioning properly and prevent contamination between different types of materials. Tallow and beeswax residues accumulated on cauldrons, moulds, and tools with every production cycle. These residues had to be completely removed before switching between different materials or quality levels, because even small amounts of contamination could affect the appearance, burning characteristics, or smell of finished candles. Cleaning required heating equipment to soften accumulated wax and fat, then scrubbing with coarse cloths and specialized cleaning solutions made from ash, sand, and various herbs. The process was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and had to be repeated frequently to maintain production standards. Tools and molds also required regular maintenance to prevent wear and damage that could affect product quality. Wooden dipping frames had to be sanded smooth and treated with protective finishes to prevent splintering or contamination. Metal molds needed careful inspection for cracks, dents, or corrosion that could create defects in finished candles. The workshop itself required constant attention to prevent fire hazards, maintain proper ventilation, and provide adequate lighting for detailed work. Medieval fire safety was a serious concern for any business that involved open flames and flammable materials. Your workshop had to comply with local fire prevention ordinances while also maintaining the controlled heating necessary for candle production. Ventilation was equally important because rendering tallow and melting wax produced smoke and vapors that could be both unpleasant and potentially harmful in enclosed spaces. Your father had installed a sophisticated system of shutters and vents that could be adjusted to maintain airflow without creating drafts that might interfere with flame control. As winter approached and demand for your candles increased, you gradually mastered the rhythm of production cycles, supplier relationships, and customer expectations that defined successful candle making in Tudor England. The work was physically demanding, technically complex, and required constant attention to detail, but it also provided steady income and a respected place in the community's economic structure. Your days began before dawn with lighting the workshop fires and checking the consistency of materials that had been cooling overnight. You would inspect yesterday's production for defects, plan the day's activities based on customer orders and inventory levels, and begin the slow process of heating tallow or melting wax to optimal temperatures for the day's planned production. The morning hours were typically devoted to preparation, cutting fresh tallow, preparing wicks, organizing molds, and ensuring that all equipment was clean and properly maintained. The actual candle making usually began around midday, when temperatures had stabilized and lighting conditions were optimal for detailed work. Afternoon production continued until early evening, when cooling temperatures and declining natural light made precise work more difficult. The final hours of each day were spent banking fires, covering materials to prevent overnight contamination, and updating production records with detailed information about quantities produced, materials consumed, and any quality issues that required attention. Your father's workshop gradually revealed its secrets through this daily routine of careful attention and methodical work. Each piece of equipment had its optimal operating conditions, each supplier had their preferred interaction style, and each customer had their specific expectations about quality and service. The wooden dipping frames worked best when the tallow temperature was just hot enough to coat evenly, but cool enough to prevent dripping between applications. The metal molds required slightly cooler wax to prevent air bubbles, but hot enough to fill completely without leaving gaps or uneven surfaces. The large rendering cauldron needed constant attention to maintain the gentle heat that gradually purified raw tallow without burning or contaminating it. These technical details became second nature through repetition and careful observation, but they were also documented in increasingly detailed notes that would eventually become your own collection of trade secrets. Medieval craftsmanship was preserved through this combination of hands-on experience and written records that captured the subtle knowledge required for consistent success. As autumn progressed toward winter and the days grew shorter, your candle workshop fell into the productive rhythm that had sustained your family's business for decades. The warm glow of controlled fires, the gentle bubbling of rendering tallow, and the steady repetition of dipping and molding created a peaceful atmosphere that seemed to exist outside the hurried pace of the world beyond your workshop walls. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood gradually faded as evening approached. The calls of street vendors closing their stalls, the conversations of neighbors returning home from their daily work, the distant chiming of church bells marking the progression of hours. Inside your workshop, time moved according to the slower rhythms of heating and cooling, dipping and drying, as another day's production of carefully crafted candles took shape in the golden light of the flames that would soon illuminate countless homes throughout Coventry. How ancient Romans folded and sealed their letters. The year is 127 CE, and you are Lucius Antonius Scriptor, a minor imperial clerk stationed in the bustling administrative complex near the Forum Roman. Your daily responsibility involves processing, formatting, and dispatching an enormous volume of official correspondence that keeps the Roman Empire functioning across 3 continents. What most people don't realize is that the simple act of folding and sealing a letter required mastering a complex system of protocols, materials, and techniques that varied depending on the recipient's rank, the message's classification level, and the specific administrative department handling the correspondence. Roman letter writing wasn't just communication. It was a sophisticated form of bureaucratic art that could determine the success or failure of military campaigns, trade negotiations, and political careers. Your workspace occupies a small but strategically located chamber within the tabularium, the massive stone building that housed Rome's central archives and administrative offices. The room contains everything necessary for professional correspondence, multiple varieties of papyrus arranged by quality and origin, an extensive collection of reed pens organized by nib width, countless small ceramic containers holding different formulations of ink, and most importantly, a carefully maintained collection of sealing materials that represented the cutting edge of Roman security technology. The morning begins, as always, with inventory and preparation. Roman bureaucrats learned early in their careers that running out of proper materials during a busy correspondence day could create delays that rippled through the entire imperial communication system. A senator expecting urgent news from Gaul wouldn't accept explanations about inadequate supplies, and provincial governors had been known to file formal complaints when their letters arrived with substandard seals or inferior papyrus. You begin by examining your papyrus supplies, which are sorted into 6 distinct categories based on quality, origin, and intended use. The finest papyrus, imported at considerable expense from the premium workshops of Alexandria, is reserved for correspondence with the emperor, high-ranking senators, and provincial governors of major territories. This papyrus is nearly white, with a smooth texture that doesn't interfere with pen strokes, and a uniform thickness that folds cleanly without cracking or tearing. The second tier consists of high-quality Egyptian papyrus, suitable for correspondence with lesser senators, wealthy patricians, and important foreign dignitaries. It's slightly more yellow than the premium grade and has a barely perceptible texture that doesn't affect legibility but costs significantly less than the top-tier material. Your middle-grade papyrus serves for routine administrative correspondence with provincial officials, military commanders, and established business associates of the imperial government. It's noticeably coarser than the premium grades, but still functional for formal communication and official record-keeping. The lower grades are used for internal memoranda, draft copies, and correspondence with minor officials who wouldn't expect premium materials. The cheapest papyrus is reserved for practice letters, temporary notes, and situations where the material itself might be destroyed after the message is delivered. But the really fascinating part was discovering that Roman letter folding techniques were actually a sophisticated encoding system that conveyed important information before the recipient even broke the seal. Different folding patterns indicated the urgency level, security classification, and proper handling procedures for each piece of correspondence. A letter folded with 3 horizontal creases, followed by 2 vertical ones, indicated routine administrative business that could be processed during normal working hours. A letter folded with alternating horizontal and vertical creases suggested time-sensitive content that required immediate attention. Letters folded into complex patterns with multiple layers and intricate creases were reserved for the most sensitive communications that might contain military intelligence, political information, or imperial instructions. These folding codes weren't written down anywhere. They were passed orally from senior clerks to junior staff and represented a form of institutional knowledge that took years to master completely. New clerks typically spent months learning to recognize different folding patterns and understand their implications for message handling and recipient notification. Your first correspondence of the day is a routine administrative update destined for Marcus Flavius Tertius, the procurator responsible for grain distribution in the province of Hispania Tarraconensis. The message concerns shipping schedules, warehouse capacity, and projected demand for the upcoming harvest season. Important information, but not urgent enough to require special handling or premium materials. You select a sheet of middle-grade papyrus and examine it carefully for defects. Even routine correspondence had to meet basic quality standards. Papyrus with visible holes, uneven thickness, or discoloration could suggest that the Roman government was either experiencing supply difficulties or didn't consider the recipient worthy of proper materials. Both implications could damage relationships with provincial officials who were sensitive about their status within the imperial hierarchy. The papyrus passes inspection, so you trim it to the standard size for administrative correspondence, roughly equivalent to a modern sheet of legal paper, but slightly narrower to accommodate the particular folding pattern required for this type of message. Roman letter sizes were strictly standardized, partly for filing efficiency, but mostly because recipients could determine the approximate importance and classification of a letter simply by observing its dimensions. Writing the letter itself follows equally rigid protocols. The opening formula depends on the relative ranks of sender and recipient, the nature of their relationship, and the specific type of business being conducted. Letters to provincial governors begin with elaborate honorific phrases that acknowledge their authority and express appropriate respect for their position. Letters to subordinate officials use more direct language that establishes the sender's authority while maintaining civil courtesy. Your letter to Marcus Flavius Tertius requires a formal but not elaborate opening. Lucius Antonius Scriptor, clerk of the imperial administration, to Marcus Flavius Tertius, procurator of grain distribution. Greetings and continued success in your worthy service to Rome. This formula establishes the sender's identity and authority, acknowledges the recipient's position and competence, and provides the conventional expression of goodwill that Roman courtesy demanded. The body of the letter follows a structured format that presents information in order of importance and relevance. Statistical data comes first: projected grain shipments, warehouse capacities, and distribution schedules. Administrative details follow: personnel assignments, budget allocations, and regulatory compliance issues. The letter concludes with any special instructions, requests for additional information, or scheduling coordination that requires the recipient's attention. Roman business correspondence was remarkably efficient, partly because everyone involved understood these structural conventions. Recipients could quickly locate the information most relevant to their responsibilities without reading through lengthy explanations or searching for buried details. Writers could organize complex information clearly without worrying about formatting decisions or stylistic variations. Once the writing is complete, you allow the ink to dry completely while preparing the sealing materials. This is where Roman correspondence became genuinely sophisticated, because sealing wasn't simply a matter of closing the letter. It was a comprehensive security system designed to prevent tampering, verify authenticity, and provide legal evidence in case of disputes. The sealing process begins with the folding, which must be executed precisely to ensure proper seal placement and tamper-evident closure. For administrative correspondence like your letter to Marcus Flavius, the standard pattern involves 3 horizontal folds that reduce the papyrus to approximately 1/4 of its original size, followed by 2 vertical folds that create a compact rectangle roughly the size of a modern index card. Each fold must be crisp and uniform, without wrinkles or uneven edges that might interfere with seal placement or suggest careless handling. Roman officials were trained to evaluate correspondence, partly based on the quality of its preparation, and sloppy folding could undermine the credibility of even the most important messages. The folding sequence also serves practical purposes. The horizontal folds are made first, with the text facing inward to protect the writing from damage during transport and handling. The vertical folds are then made to create multiple layers that provide structural strength and make the letter more difficult to open without detection. But the really incredible part was the sealing wax technology, which was far more sophisticated than most people realize. Roman sealing wax wasn't simply melted candle material. It was a carefully formulated compound designed to provide specific security, durability, and authentication characteristics. Different wax formulations were used for different types of correspondence, and the composition could be analyzed to verify the authenticity of seals and detect attempts at forgery or tampering. Standard administrative wax was made from beeswax mixed with pine resin and a small amount of vermilion powder that gave it a distinctive reddish color. This formulation created seals that were hard enough to resist accidental damage, but brittle enough that any attempt to remove or alter them would leave obvious evidence of tampering. High-security wax used for sensitive correspondence included additional ingredients that made forgery more difficult. Powdered ivory created seals with a distinctive texture that was difficult to replicate. Rare mineral pigments produced colors that couldn't be matched without access to specific materials. Some high-security formulations included organic compounds that would change color or develop distinctive odors if exposed to heat or chemicals commonly used in tampering attempts. Your letter to Marcus Flavius requires standard administrative wax, which you prepare by melting the appropriate mixture in a small bronze brazier designed specifically for sealing work. The temperature has to be carefully controlled. Too hot, and the wax becomes too fluid to hold detailed impressions. Too cool, and it won't flow properly or adhere securely to the papyrus. While the wax heats, you select the appropriate seal for this type of correspondence. Roman seals weren't just decorative, they were sophisticated identification and authentication devices that served multiple bureaucratic functions simultaneously. Your personal seal, carved from a piece of carnelian stone, bears your name, official title, and a small symbol indicating your department within the imperial administration. This seal identifies you as the sender and provides verification that the letter originated from an authorized source within the government bureaucracy. However, for official correspondence like this letter, you also need to apply a departmental seal that indicates the specific office and authority under which the message is being sent. This second seal serves as additional authentication and helps recipients route the correspondence to appropriate personnel for response or action. The departmental seal is larger and more elaborate than personal seals, carved from expensive materials and featuring complex designs that are difficult to forge. Your department seal shows the classical figure of Annona, the goddess of grain supply, surrounded by symbols representing abundance, distribution, and imperial authority. The craftsmanship is exceptional, with fine details that would be nearly impossible to replicate without access to master engravers and specialized tools. Applying the seals requires considerable skill and attention to detail. The wax must be heated to exactly the right temperature, applied in sufficient quantity to create a strong bond with the papyrus, and impressed with the seal while still hot enough to capture fine details, but cool enough that the design doesn't blur or spread. You pour a small pool of molten wax onto the folded letter, positioning it carefully to overlap the edges of the final fold and create a tamper-evident closure. The wax flows smoothly across the papyrus surface, adhering to both layers and creating a mechanical bond that can't be broken without destroying the seal. While the wax is still molten, you press your personal seal firmly into the center of the pool, holding steady pressure for several seconds to ensure that all details of the design transfer clearly. The warm wax flows around the carved surfaces, creating a perfect negative impression that captures every line and symbol of your identification seal. Before the wax has completely cooled, you carefully position the departmental seal, slightly overlapping your personal impression. This technique creates a composite seal that combines both authentication elements while making forgery or alteration extremely difficult. Anyone attempting to tamper with the correspondence would have to perfectly recreate both seals and their precise positioning relative to each other. The sealing process concludes with a careful inspection to ensure that both impressions are clear, complete, and properly positioned. Roman correspondence standards required that seals be legible enough for easy identification, but complex enough to resist casual forgery attempts. Seals that were too light might not provide adequate security, while seals that were too heavy could obscure important details or create weak points that might crack during transport. Once the seals have cooled and hardened completely, you add the final element of Roman correspondence security: the external addressing and routing information. This isn't simply written on the outside of the letter. It's encoded in a way that provides additional verification and helps prevent misdirection or interception. The recipient's name and address are written in a standardized format that includes their full official title, current posting, and administrative classification. Marcus Flavius Tertius is identified as Procurator Annonae Provincia Hispania Tarraconensis, which indicates not only his name and position, but also his specific area of responsibility and the province where he's currently stationed. Below the address, you add routing codes that will help imperial messengers and postal stations handle the correspondence efficiently. These codes indicate the priority level, preferred transport method, and any special handling requirements. Your letter receives the code Admin Routine Terrestre, which tells postal clerks that it contains administrative information, doesn't require urgent delivery, and can be sent via standard overland routes. The return information includes your name, title, location, and a reference number that will help you track the correspondence and match any replies to the original message. Roman bureaucrats maintained detailed records of all outgoing correspondence, partly for administrative efficiency, but mostly because accountability was essential in a system where miscommunication could have serious political or military consequences. But the most fascinating aspect of Roman letter distribution was the imperial postal system itself, which was arguably the most sophisticated communication network in the ancient world. The cursus publicus, as the postal system was officially known, operated a network of stations, messengers and transport services that could deliver correspondence across the empire with remarkable speed and reliability. Letters sent from Rome could reach provincial capitals in Gaul within 2 weeks, arrive in Egypt within a month, and be delivered to frontier military outposts within 6 weeks under normal conditions. This system required enormous resources and careful coordination. Postal stations had to be maintained at regular intervals along major roads, with supplies of fresh horses, competent messengers, and secure storage for correspondence awaiting transport. Route schedules had to be coordinated to minimize delays and ensure that messages could be transferred efficiently between different segments of their journey. The postal system also had to maintain security standards that prevented interception, theft, or tampering during transport. Messengers carried official identification and worked in pairs when transporting sensitive correspondence. Postal stations were fortified and guarded to protect stored messages from theft or enemy action. Major routes were patrolled to discourage bandits and ensure that messengers could travel safely even through potentially dangerous territory. Your letter to Marcus Flavius will begin its journey at the Central Dispatch Office, where it will be sorted by destination and assigned to the next available transport heading toward Hispania. The initial leg of the journey will probably be handled by a mounted messenger who can cover the distance from Rome to the major postal station at Massilia within a week under favourable conditions. At Massilia, the letter will be transferred to messengers specialising in the Spanish routes, who understand the local conditions, speak the regional languages, and know the most efficient paths through the Pyrenees Mountains. These specialists can navigate the challenging terrain and unpredictable weather that often delayed correspondence between Gaul and the Iberian provinces. The final delivery will be handled by local messengers familiar with the specific administrative centres and personnel in Hispania Tarraconensis. They know which officials are currently in residence at their assigned posts, how to locate recipients who might be travelling on official business, and what protocols to follow if immediate delivery isn't possible. This entire system operates with clockwork precision because Roman administrators understood that communication was the foundation of effective governance. An empire spanning 3 continents and governing dozens of provinces could only function if information flowed reliably between the central government and its far-flung representatives. While your letter begins its journey towards Spain, you turn your attention to the next piece of correspondence in your daily workload, a much more complex and sensitive communication that will require different materials, specialized folding techniques, and enhanced security measures. This letter is destined for Gaius Iulius Maximus, the Legatus Augusti responsible for military operations along the Rhine frontier. The message contains intelligence reports, troop movement authorizations, and strategic recommendations that could affect the security of Rome's northern borders. It represents the type of high-stakes correspondence that made Roman letter writing a profession requiring both technical expertise and absolute discretion. You select a sheet of premium Alexandrian papyrus for this communication, examining it even more carefully than usual, because any defects in materials used for military correspondence could be interpreted as a sign of administrative negligence or insufficient respect for the recipient's critical responsibilities. The papyrus is flawless, uniformly white, perfectly smooth, and exactly the right thickness for the complex folding pattern required for classified military communications. This folding technique involves 7 different creases arranged in a specific sequence that creates multiple layers of security while indicating to the recipient that the message contains information requiring special handling and secure storage. The writing itself follows protocols established specifically for military correspondence. The opening formulas are more elaborate than those used for routine administrative letters, acknowledging not only the recipient's rank and authority, but also expressing appropriate recognition of the dangers and responsibilities associated with frontier command. The content is organized according to military communication standards, with intelligence reports presented first, followed by operational authorizations, and concluding with strategic recommendations that require the recipient's professional judgment. Each section is clearly marked with standardized headers that help military commanders quickly locate the information most relevant to their immediate tactical and strategic needs. But the sealing process for military correspondence involves an entirely different level of complexity and security. Instead of standard administrative wax, you prepare a high-security formulation that includes powdered ivory, rare mineral pigments, and organic compounds designed to detect tampering attempts. This wax is more expensive and difficult to work with, but it creates seals that are virtually impossible to forge or alter without specialized knowledge and materials. The sealing pattern for military correspondence also differs significantly from routine administrative techniques. Instead of simple, overlapping seals, military letters receive a complex arrangement of multiple impressions that create a tamper-evident closure requiring specific knowledge to open properly. Your personal seal is applied first, positioned in the center of the wax pool, and impressed with extra care to ensure that every detail transfers clearly. The military departmental seal is then applied partially, overlapping your personal impression, creating a composite authentication that would be extremely difficult to replicate. The final element is a special security seal, reserved for correspondence containing classified military information. This seal is larger and more elaborate than standard departmental seals, featuring complex geometric patterns and symbolic elements that represent the authority of the Imperial Military Command structure. The three seals are arranged in a specific triangular pattern that not only provides multiple layers of authentication, but also creates a mechanical closure that can't be opened without breaking at least one of the wax impressions. Anyone attempting to read the letter would have to destroy evidence of tampering, making unauthorized access immediately obvious to the intended recipient. As the afternoon progresses and you work through your daily correspondence queue, the rhythm of letter preparation becomes almost meditative. The careful selection of materials, the precise execution of folding techniques, the controlled application of sealing wax, and the detailed attention to addressing and routing procedures create a structured routine that transforms chaotic information into organized communication. Each letter represents a small but essential element in the vast administrative machinery that keeps the Roman Empire functioning smoothly. Your grain distribution correspondence helps ensure that provincial populations remain fed and stable. Your military communications support the strategic planning that protects Rome's frontiers. Your diplomatic letters maintain the relationships and treaties that prevent unnecessary conflicts. The work requires concentration, skill, and attention to detail, but it also provides the satisfaction of contributing to something larger and more enduring than individual concerns. Roman bureaucrats understood that their careful adherence to established procedures and protocols helped maintain the stability and prosperity that made civilized life possible throughout the known world. As evening approaches and the natural light in your chamber begins to fade, you complete the final pieces of correspondence in your daily queue and begin the process of securing your workspace for the night. Unused papyrus must be stored properly to prevent damage from moisture or insects. Ink containers need to be sealed to prevent evaporation or contamination. Sealing materials must be organized and inventoried to ensure adequate supplies for tomorrow's work. The completed letters are transferred to the central dispatch office, where they will be sorted, roted, and assigned to the appropriate messengers for delivery throughout the empire. Your small contribution to the vast flow of Roman communication will join thousands of other messages traveling along the network of roads, sea routes, and postal stations that connected the civilized world. Outside your window, the sounds of Rome gradually shift from the busy activity of daytime commerce to the quieter rhythms of evening as citizens return to their homes and families. The great city settles into the peaceful routine of another day, successfully completed, another collection of challenges met and resolved through the patient application of established procedures and time-tested systems. In workshops and offices throughout the empire, other clerks and administrators are concluding their own daily contributions to the enormous task of governing a diverse collection of peoples and territories stretching from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Black Sea. Each carefully folded letter, each precisely applied seal, each accurately addressed message represents a small thread in the vast tapestry of communication that held the Roman world together through centuries of growth, prosperity, and cultural achievement. The gentle scraping of reed pens on papyrus, the soft bubbling of heating wax, and the quiet satisfaction of work completed with professional precision fade gradually into the peaceful silence of evening, as another day in the endless rhythm of imperial administration draws to its close. The first frost always came as a shock, even when everyone had been watching for it since the barley harvest. In the village of Little Wickham, nestled in the rolling hills of Yorkshire, the morning when Thomas the miller found ice crystals clinging to his water bucket meant one thing: winter preparation could no longer be postponed. The rhythm of autumn in a medieval village followed patterns established over generations, each task building upon the last, in a careful sequence that meant the difference between surviving until spring or not. What's fascinating is how methodically organized this process was. Every household, every guild, every merchant following protocols that had been refined through centuries of bitter experience. Agnes, the reeve's wife, began her winter preparations in late September, not because she was particularly anxious, but because the village ordinances required it. The manor court had established specific dates for various winter preparations, and failing to comply meant fines that could devastate a family's already precarious finances. Her first task was taking inventory of the family's grain stores, counting out each bushel of wheat, barley, and oats, with the same precision a modern accountant might use for financial records. The grain had to be stored in wooden chests lined with dried mint and lavender, not for the pleasant smell, but because these herbs deterred the mice and weevils that could destroy a winter's worth of food in a matter of weeks. Agnes would layer the grain carefully, one bushel at a time, sprinkling the herbs between each layer, and making careful notations on a piece of bark about exactly how much had been stored and when. But storing grain was only the beginning. The village blacksmith, Robert Fitzhugh, had his own elaborate winter preparations that began with stockpiling charcoal. Not just any charcoal. Winter charcoal had to be made from specific types of wood that would burn hot enough to keep his forge operational, even in the depths of January. He would spend entire days in late October selecting oak and ash branches, cutting them to precise lengths, and arranging them in carefully constructed mounds that would smoulder for days to create the dense, slow-burning charcoal he needed. The process of making winter charcoal was almost ritualistic. Robert would build his charcoal mounds in the same clearing his father had used, covering the wood with layers of turf and clay, in patterns passed down through generations of smiths. Each mound required constant tending. Too much air, and the wood would burn to ash; too little, and it wouldn't carbonize properly. He would sleep next to the mounds for 3 nights running, waking every few hours to check the smoke and adjust the air holes. Meanwhile, the village women were engaged in their own intricate preparations. Winter clothing wasn't simply pulled from storage, it had to be completely overhauled each year. Margaret the weaver would spend weeks checking every garment for moth damage, reinforcing seams that had weakened over the summer, and applying fresh treatments of lanolin to make wool cloaks water-resistant. The process of preparing winter cloaks reveals just how much skill was required for basic survival. Each cloak had to be carefully felted, a process that involves soaking the wool in hot water mixed with human urine, then beating it with wooden paddles for hours until the fibers locked together into a dense, waterproof fabric. The smell was by all accounts memorable, which is probably why this work was done in a shed well downwind of the village centre. But perhaps the most crucial winter preparation was preserving meat. November was slaughter month, when livestock that couldn't be fed through the winter were butchered and preserved using techniques that would seem elaborate by modern standards. The village butcher, William Fleshewer, followed procedures that had been codified by the Guild of Butchers and were enforced with surprising rigour. First, the weather had to be exactly right. Cold enough to prevent spoilage, but not so cold that the meat would freeze before it could be properly salted. William would check the sky each morning, looking for the particular combination of clear skies and sharp wind that indicated ideal butchering conditions. When the conditions were right, the entire village would mobilize in a coordinated effort that resembled a military operation. The actual process of preserving beef for winter storage was astonishingly complex. The meat had to be cut into specific sizes. Pieces too large wouldn't cure properly. Pieces too small would become too salty to eat. Each piece was then rubbed with a precise mixture of salt, pepper, and herbs, with the proportions carefully measured using standardized village measures that were checked annually by the manor court. After salting, the meat was packed in wooden barrels in alternating layers: meat, salt, with each layer packed down using wooden blocks to eliminate air pockets that could lead to spoilage. The barrels were then sealed with a mixture of tallow and ash, creating an airtight seal that would preserve the meat for months. But winter preparation wasn't just about food and clothing. The village had to prepare its infrastructure for the harsh months ahead. The miller, Thomas, had to ensure his mill pond wouldn't freeze solid, a process that involved installing a complex system of wooden channels that would keep water moving even in the coldest weather. The mill race had to be cleared of debris, its wooden channels reinforced with iron brackets, and the water wheel itself treated with pine pitch to prevent the wood from cracking in freezing temperatures. Thomas would spend days checking every joint, every bearing, every wooden gear, replacing anything that showed signs of wear. A broken mill in January meant the village would have no way to grind grain into flour, turning winter from difficult to potentially fatal. The village church required its own elaborate winter preparations. Father Edmund had to arrange for enough candles to last through the long winter nights, when services might be held in complete darkness. Medieval candles weren't simply dipped and stored, they had to be made from specific types of tallow, mixed in precise proportions and shaped using techniques that would ensure they burned evenly and didn't drip excessively. The process of making winter candles was surprisingly technical. The tallow had to be rendered at exactly the right temperature, too hot, and it would produce smoky, uneven candles, too cool, and it wouldn't mix properly with the wicks. Father Edmund would oversee the candle-making process personally, checking each batch for consistency and quality. The church records show detailed inventories of candle supplies, with careful notations about which batches burned best and which needed to be remade. Even the village well required winter preparation. The well keeper, an appointed position that rotated annually among the village householders, had to ensure the well wouldn't freeze and that the wooden windlass used to draw water would continue to function in cold weather. This involved applying special treatments to the rope, a mixture of pine tar and sheep fat that would keep it flexible even in freezing temperatures. The rope itself had to be carefully inspected for signs of wear, with weak sections replaced before winter set in. A broken well rope in January could mean the entire village would have to melt snow for water, a time-consuming process that required enormous amounts of fuel. The well keeper would test the rope by hanging heavy stones from it, checking each section for signs of stretching or fraying. Village documentation from the period shows that winter preparations were taken so seriously that the manor court would conduct formal inspections. The reeve would visit each household, checking that grain stores were adequate, that winter clothing was in good repair, and that each family had sufficient fuel stockpiled. Households that failed inspection could be fined, and in severe cases might be required to share their resources with families that had prepared adequately. The process of stockpiling fuel was particularly elaborate. Each household was required to maintain a winter fuel store equivalent to a specific number of cartloads, calculated based on the size of the house and the number of residents. The fuel had to be properly seasoned. Green wood that hadn't dried adequately would produce too much smoke and not enough heat, making it essentially worthless for winter heating. Families would begin cutting and splitting their winter wood supply in late summer, stacking it in carefully constructed piles that allowed air to circulate while protecting the wood from rain. The wood had to be turned periodically to ensure even drying, and each family maintained detailed records of how much wood they had stockpiled and when it had been cut. The village carpenter, Master John, had his own specialized winter preparations. His tools had to be treated with special oils to prevent rust during the damp winter months, and his workspace had to be sealed and insulated to allow him to continue working even in freezing weather. Medieval woodworking tools were expensive and difficult to replace, so protecting them through winter was crucial for maintaining the village's ability to make repairs and construct new buildings. Master John would spend days in late autumn cleaning and oiling each tool individually. His planes, chisels, awls, and measuring instruments all received careful attention. He would wrap metal tools in oiled cloth, store wooden handles in dry sand to prevent cracking, and arrange his entire workshop according to a system that would allow him to find specific tools even in the dim light of winter days. But perhaps the most intricate winter preparations involved the village's brewing operation. Medieval villagers consumed enormous quantities of ale. It was safer than water and provided necessary calories during the lean winter months. The village alewife, Goodwife Martha, had to ensure adequate supplies of ale would be available throughout the winter, which required careful planning and precise timing. Brewing winter ale was different from brewing summer ale. Winter ales had to be stronger and more heavily hopped to prevent spoilage during long storage periods. Martha would begin brewing her winter ales in October, using carefully hoarded supplies of barley malt and precious hops that had been dried and stored since the summer harvest. The brewing process itself was rigidly controlled by village ordinances. The temperature of the water, the timing of each step, the specific vessels used, all were regulated to ensure consistent quality. Martha would maintain detailed records of each batch, noting the weather conditions, the quality of ingredients, and how well each batch aged. Winter ale had to be stored in specially prepared barrels that had been treated with pitch and sealed with wax. Each barrel was marked with symbols indicating when it had been brewed and what strength it was, allowing Martha to rotate her stock and ensure that older ale was consumed first. The village had strict penalties for ale that had spoiled or been improperly stored. Waste of precious winter resources was considered a serious offence. As November progressed, the pace of winter preparations would intensify. Families would begin the process of chinking their houses, filling gaps between logs with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that would harden into an effective barrier against winter winds. This wasn't casual home maintenance. It was a methodical process that required specific materials mixed in precise proportions. The chinking mixture had to be prepared weeks in advance, allowing the various components to mature and develop the proper consistency. Too much straw and the mixture wouldn't adhere properly. Too much mud and it would crack as it dried. Each family guarded their particular chinking recipe, handed down through generations and refined through trial and error. Windows, which were often just openings covered with oiled cloth or thin sheets of horn, required special winter treatments. The cloth had to be re-oiled with fresh linseed oil to maintain its transparency and weather resistance. Families would spend entire evenings working on their windows, carefully applying thin coats of oil and smoothing out any wrinkles or bubbles that could let in drafts. The village's livestock required their own elaborate winter preparations. Cattle, sheep, and pigs couldn't simply be left to forage during winter months. They had to be provided with carefully prepared feed that would keep them alive until spring. The village cowherd, Peter, would spend weeks preparing winter fodder, cutting and drying grass, collecting acorns and other nuts, and preparing special feed mixtures for pregnant animals. Livestock shelters had to be reinforced and weatherproofed. Medieval barns weren't the sturdy structures we might imagine. They were often simple wooden frames covered with woven branches and mud. These had to be carefully maintained, with weak sections reinforced and gaps sealed. Peter would spend days checking every joint, every support beam, ensuring that the shelters would protect the village's valuable livestock through the harsh winter months. The process of preparing winter feed was surprisingly complex. Different animals required different types of fodder, and the proportions had to be carefully calculated to ensure adequate nutrition. Pregnant animals needed special feed mixtures rich in specific nutrients, while working animals required high-energy foods that would sustain them through the demanding winter months. Even the village's chickens required special winter care. Medieval chickens were smaller and hardier than modern breeds, but they still needed protection from the harsh winter weather. Chicken coops had to be insulated with straw and equipped with special nesting boxes that would encourage the hens to continue laying eggs through the winter months. The process of winterizing chicken coops involved more than just adding insulation. The coops had to be sealed against predators that would be hungrier and more desperate during winter months. Foxes, weasels, and other predators would go to extraordinary lengths to reach a warm chicken coop, so the defenses had to be correspondingly elaborate. Medieval chickens were also fed special winter diets designed to keep them healthy and productive. These diets included kitchen scraps, grain sweepings, and carefully prepared mixtures of herbs that were believed to prevent disease and maintain egg production. Village records show detailed inventories of chicken feed, with specific notations about which mixtures produced the best results. As winter approached, the village would conduct a final series of inspections and preparations. The constable would check that every household had adequate supplies, that winter clothing was in good repair, and that each family understood the procedures for dealing with winter emergencies. These weren't casual checks. They were formal inspections documented in village records and subject to review by manor officials. The final weeks before winter also saw a flurry of social preparations. Marriages were often scheduled for late autumn, allowing new couples to combine their resources and better survive the winter months. Village festivals and celebrations were planned for the darkest months, providing community events that would help maintain morale during the long, isolated winter period. But perhaps the most important winter preparations were the least visible. The careful attention to small details that could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Every household would check and recheck their winter supplies, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. Families would practice emergency procedures, making sure everyone knew where supplies were stored and what to do if storms cut them off from the rest of the village. The process of preparing for winter in a medieval village was ultimately about recognizing that survival depended on methodical preparation, community cooperation, and attention to countless small details. Each family's preparations were interconnected with their neighbors, creating a web of mutual dependence that helped ensure the entire community would survive until spring. As the last autumn days grew shorter and the first serious frosts began to appear regularly, families would complete their final preparations with a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had done everything possible to ensure their survival through the coming months. The grain was stored, The meat was preserved, the fuel was stacked, and the winter clothing was ready. All that remained was to settle in and wait for spring to return, sustained by the careful preparations that had occupied their autumn days and nights. The rhythm of these preparations, repeated year after year, generation after generation, created a sense of continuity and security that helped medieval communities survive in an uncertain world. Each task, each careful detail, each methodical procedure was part of a larger pattern of survival that had been refined through centuries of experience, ensuring that the village would endure through another winter and emerge ready for the cycle to begin again.